A 12-year-old girl with a notebook and a curious mind just cracked the code that stumped Harvard MBAs, Fortune 500 consultants, and Silicon Valley's brightest minds for 2 decades. In the marble halls of one of America's most prestigious corporate empires, a solution was hiding in plain sight, and the person who found it wasn't supposed to be looking. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 3 years, Rebecca Martinez and her 12-year-old daughter Sofia had called the executive wing of Patterson Industries their workplace. Rebecca cleaned the offices that decided the fate of thousands of employees. Sofia did her homework in empty conference rooms where million-dollar deals were born and died. To most, they were invisible, the quiet efficiency that kept the machine running. But Sofia had inherited something from her late father, a mechanical engineer who taught her that every problem has a pattern, every breakdown has a story, and every impossible puzzle has a solution if you know where to look. What she discovered in a discarded spreadsheet would change everything. An insight so simple it seemed obvious, yet so profound it would save an empire from collapse. The 42nd floor of the Patterson Industries tower hummed with the energy of controlled desperation. At 6:30 a.m., when most of Chicago was still wrapped in sleep, the executive offices were already alive with the frantic activity of a company fighting for its survival. Sofia Martinez pressed herself against the wall as another group of suited consultants hurried past, their voices sharp with urgency and their briefcases heavy with reports that promised solutions but delivered only more questions. She had learned to read the rhythm of this place, to understand the subtle signals that adults thought children couldn't perceive. Her mother, Rebecca, moved through the offices like a ghost, emptying trash cans and dusting surfaces with the practiced efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of being essential yet invisible. Sofia watched from her corner desk in the break room, her math homework spread before her, but her attention fixed on the drama unfolding around them. 37 consulting firms, she heard someone mutter as they passed. 37 different reports, and we're still hemorrhaging money. Patterson Industries had been bleeding for 20 years. Not the dramatic collapse that made headlines, but the slow, relentless drain that was somehow worse. A manufacturing giant that had once employed 60,000 people across 14 states, now struggling with a problem that seemed to have no solution. Every product line lost money. Every efficiency expert found new inefficiencies. Every cost-cutting measure somehow increased costs. Sofia's father had worked for a smaller company that faced similar struggles before his unexpected heart attack 2 years ago. He had taught her to look at numbers, not as abstract concepts, but as stories. "Every number tells you something, mi amor," he would say, pointing to the blueprints spread across their kitchen table. "The trick is learning their language." Now, watching the endless parade of worried executives and frustrated consultants, Sofia found herself remembering those lessons. Her homework forgotten, she began to pay closer attention to the fragments of conversation that drifted through the sterile air of the executive floor. Thomas Patterson III, the third-generation CEO of the company that bore his family name, was a man carrying the weight of legacy and failure in equal measure. At 58, his once dark hair had turned silver, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had tried everything and found nothing that worked. Unlike many wealthy executives, Patterson treated the cleaning staff with respect. He knew Rebecca's name, asked about Sofia's schoolwork, and always said thank you. But there was a distance there, not born of arrogance, but of exhaustion. He was drowning in his own company's problems, and the effort to stay afloat left little energy for anything else. This particular morning, Sofia noticed something different in his demeanor. The usual controlled desperation had been replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. As Rebecca worked in his office, Sofia could hear him on a conference call, his voice heavy with resignation. The Hartley Group presented their findings yesterday. Same conclusion as McKinsey, same as Deloitte. They're recommending we divest the manufacturing division entirely, basically telling us to become a holding company managing our own liquidation. Sofia looked up from her algebra problems. She had heard the name Hartley Group before. They were the latest in a long line of consulting firms hired to solve Patterson Industries' mysterious profitability crisis. Her notebook, the one she used for schoolwork, had slowly filled with observations about these various consulting teams over the months. She had a habit of writing things down, a trait her father had encouraged. "Smart people don't trust their memory alone, Sofia," he had told her. "They write things down so they can see patterns." Without really thinking about it, she had been documenting the patterns she observed in the executive wing. Which consultants stayed longest? Which ones left early? Which teams seemed confident and which ones looked defeated? She had noted which departments they visited, which employees she interviewed, and which reports seemed to generate the most heated discussions. What she had never done was look at all these observations together. The pattern that emerged made her pause. Every consulting team followed essentially the same process. They interviewed the same senior executives. They analyzed the same financial reports. They visited the same flagship facilities, and they all reached remarkably similar conclusions. The company was fundamentally flawed in ways that couldn't be fixed. But there was something else in her notes, something that none of these highly paid consultants seemed to have noticed. The cleaning staff, the maintenance workers, the cafeteria employees, the people who moved through every department, every shift, every level of the company, they all told different stories than the executives. Rebecca often came home with fragments of these stories, workers who talked about rush orders that made no sense, machines that ran empty because materials arrived at the wrong time, products that were manufactured, stored, and then scrapped without ever being shipped. Small inefficiencies that seemed insignificant individually, but formed a web of waste when viewed together. Sofia began to cross-reference her observations with her mother's casual mentions of workplace oddities. What emerged was a picture that didn't match the financial reports or executive summaries that the consultants were analyzing. She thought about her father's engineering principles. When a machine breaks down, you don't just look at the control panel, you follow the entire system from input to output, and you pay special attention to the parts that everyone else ignores because they seem too small to matter. As she sat in the break room that morning, watching another team of consultants prepare for another round of executive interviews, Sofia realized that every consulting firm was making the same fundamental error. They were analyzing the control panel without understanding the machine. The executives they interviewed were like the displays on a dashboard. They showed the symptoms of problems, not the problems themselves. The real machinery of Patterson Industries, the actual processes that created or destroyed value, were happening in places these consultants never visited, among people they never spoke to. Sofia flipped to a fresh page in her notebook and began to draw a simple diagram. On the left side, she listed all the departments that consultants typically analyzed: executive management, finance, marketing, strategic planning. On the right side, she listed the departments her mother cleaned: shipping, receiving, quality control, maintenance, materials handling. The pattern was striking. The consultants were spending millions to analyze the departments that made decisions about the work, but none of them were studying the departments where the actual work happened. She remembered something her father had told her about a factory he had consulted for early in his career. "They hired me to fix their production line because it was running at 60% efficiency," he had said. "All the engineers were focused on the machinery, trying to optimize the manufacturing process. But I spent my first day talking to the workers who loaded the raw materials. Turns out the problem wasn't in the production line at all. It was in the loading dock where materials were being delivered in the wrong sequence. Fix the loading dock, and the entire production line ran perfectly. Could it be that simple? Could Patterson Industries' 20-year crisis have a solution that was hiding in plain sight, in the places where the work actually happened rather than where the decisions were made? Sofia looked at her watch. Her mother would be finished with Patterson's office soon, and they would head to the next floor. But for the first time in months, Sofia found herself genuinely curious about something happening in the adult world around her. She closed her math book and opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "What are the consultants missing?" It was a question that would change everything. But first, she needed to understand what Patterson Industries actually did, not according to the corporate reports and executive presentations that the consultants were analyzing, but according to the people who did the actual work. As she began to formulate a plan to find out, Sofia couldn't have known that she was about to embark on an investigation that would reveal one of the most expensive blind spots in corporate America. She was simply a curious 12-year-old girl who had learned to pay attention to details that adults overlooked. But sometimes, that's exactly what it takes to solve an impossible problem. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sofia's plan began with something she had always taken for granted, her mother's daily routine. For 3 years, she had followed Rebecca through the corridors of Patterson Industries without truly understanding the geography of the operation. But now, with her notebook ready and her father's analytical training guiding her thoughts, she began to map the company in a way no consultant ever had. The first thing she discovered was that Patterson Industries was much larger and more complex than she had imagined. The 42nd floor executive suite was just the tip of an iceberg that extended down 30 floors and across 4 separate buildings, connected by underground tunnels. Her mother's work took them through manufacturing floors, warehouse levels, shipping docks, and maintenance areas that existed in a different world from the polished conference rooms where consultants conducted their interviews. On Tuesday morning, as Rebecca began her rounds in the materials handling department, Sofia positioned herself at a small table in the break room and began her own systematic investigation. She had learned that the best way to get information was to listen rather than ask questions. Adults, she had noticed, often forgot that children were present and would speak freely about their work, their frustrations, and their observations.
Marcus Thompson, a forklift operator who had worked at Patterson for 15 years, was the first to unknowingly contribute to Sofia's research. During his coffee break, he sat at the table next to hers and called his wife, speaking in the casual tone of someone who assumed his conversation was private. "Yeah, honey, it's the same thing again today," Marcus said into his phone. "They've got us loading product line C onto trucks bound for Ohio, but the Ohio facility called yesterday to say they don't have storage space for it. So we'll load it up, send it out, and it'll come right back next week." Meanwhile, the Tennessee plant is screaming that they need those same products, but corporate says the Tennessee order isn't scheduled until next month. Sofia looked up from her homework, her pen hovering over her notebook. She had heard similar stories from her mother, but had never connected them to the larger financial crisis. Now, with Marcus's conversation providing concrete details, she began to see a pattern. She waited until Marcus finished his call and was walking back to his forklift before approaching him. She had learned that adults were more comfortable talking to children if they felt they were helping with schoolwork. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson," she said politely. "I'm working on a project about transportation for school. Do you mind if I ask you about your job?" Marcus smiled. He had noticed Sofia around the building and appreciated that she was always respectful and well-behaved. "Sure, kid. What do you want to know?" "How do you know where to send the products you load?" "Well, I get a work order from the shipping department. It tells me what products to load and where they're supposed to go. Pretty straightforward, except..." "Except what?" Marcus glanced around, then leaned in slightly. Between you and me, kid, about half the time the work orders don't match what the receiving end actually needs. I've been doing this job long enough to recognize the patterns. We send stuff places where it sits in warehouses, and then we pay to ship it somewhere else later. Or we send products to facilities that aren't equipped to handle them. It's like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Sofia wrote this down carefully. Does anyone know about this problem? Oh, everyone who actually does the work knows. But the supervisors, they're judged on whether they follow the shipping schedules, not on whether the shipments make sense. And the people who make the schedules, they're up in the offices where you and your mom work. They never come down here to see what actually happens. This conversation opened a floodgate. Over the following days, Sofia began talking to workers throughout the building. What she discovered was an underground network of people who had developed informal systems to work around the official processes that didn't function properly. In the quality control department, she met Janet Williams, a technician who had been with the company for 12 years. Janet explained that the official quality testing procedures were designed by engineers who had never worked on a production floor. The tests took too long, used the wrong criteria, and often identified defects that didn't actually affect product performance. So, we run the official tests to keep management happy, but we also do our own quick assessments that actually tell us whether the products will work for customers. The problem is, sometimes products that fail our real tests pass the official tests, and products that pass our real tests fail the official ones. Management only sees the official results, so they make decisions based on bad information. In the maintenance department, Sofia encountered Robert Chen, a mechanic whose job was to keep the manufacturing equipment running. Robert had developed an intricate understanding of which machines were reliable and which ones were problematic, but his insights never reached the people making production schedules. Machine B7 breaks down every third Tuesday like clockwork. Has been doing it for 2 years. I've filed reports, but scheduling still puts our biggest orders through B7 on Tuesdays. Then when it breaks down, they blame maintenance for poor planning. Meanwhile, machine B12 sits idle most of the time, even though it's more reliable and faster than B7. The pattern was becoming clear. Patterson Industries wasn't suffering from a mysterious management crisis or market forces beyond their control. They were suffering from a massive disconnect between the people who made decisions and the people who understood how the work actually got done. Sofia's notebook filled with examples of this disconnect. Products were manufactured in the wrong order, creating inventory bottlenecks. Materials were ordered based on theoretical schedules rather than actual production capacity. Quality standards were enforced that bore no relation to customer needs. Shipping schedules were created that ignored the physical limitations of warehouses and transportation networks. But the most striking discovery came from her conversation with Elena Rodriguez, a data entry clerk in the accounting department. Elena's job was to input production numbers into the company's central database, the same database that consultants use to analyze company performance. The numbers I enter aren't wrong, but they don't tell the whole story. Like yesterday, I entered that we produced 10,000 units of product X. That's accurate. But what the database doesn't show is that 3,000 of those units were produced to replace items damaged in shipping because they were packaged incorrectly, and another 2,000 were produced to fulfill an order that was supposed to be filled with product Y, but the work order was wrong. So the consultants looking at the database think you made 10,000 units of product X, but really you only made 5,000 useful units.
Exactly. And since the consultants never talk to the people who actually do the work, they never learn that the numbers they're analyzing are missing half the context. That evening, as Sofia and her mother rode the bus home, Sofia stared out the window at the Chicago skyline and tried to process what she had learned. Her father had always told her that complex problems usually had simple causes that were hiding in plain sight. Patterson Industries' 20-year crisis wasn't caused by market competition or technological obsolescence. It was caused by a communication breakdown so fundamental that the company had essentially split into two separate organizations: the people who made decisions and the people who did the work. The consultants weren't failing because they lacked intelligence or expertise. They were failing because they were analyzing a company that existed only on paper and in databases, while the real company, the one where products were actually made and shipped and sold, remained invisible to them. Sofia opened her notebook to a fresh page and began sketching what she thought of as the two Patterson Industries. On the left side, she drew the company as consultants saw it: clean organizational charts, logical processes, clear lines of authority. On the right side, she drew the company as workers experienced it: improvised solutions, informal networks, workarounds that kept things functioning despite official processes that didn't work. The solution seemed almost embarrassingly obvious. Instead of hiring more consultants to analyze the same flawed data and interview the same disconnected executives, Patterson Industries needed to bridge the gap between decision-makers and workers. The people who knew how to fix the problems were already employed by the company. They just weren't being listened to. But how could a 12-year-old girl convince a billionaire CEO that the solution to his 20-year crisis was hidden among the employees he walked past every day? How could she make him understand that the answer wasn't in another consultant's report, but in the conversations happening in break rooms and maintenance shops throughout his own building? Sofia closed her notebook and made a decision. She would find a way to show Thomas Patterson III what his own company actually looked like, not through reports or presentations, but through the eyes of the people who made it work despite all the obstacles placed in their way. The question was no longer what the solution was. The question was whether she could find the courage to present it to someone who had the power to implement it, and whether he would have the wisdom to listen to insights that came from a source no consultant would ever think to consult. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the company cafeteria. Sofia had never paid much attention to the food service operation, viewing it simply as a place to get a snack while her mother worked. But on Thursday afternoon, as Sofia sat reviewing her notes from the past week, she overheard a conversation that made everything click into place. Angela Porter, the cafeteria manager, was training a new employee on inventory procedures. What Sofia heard made her realize that the cafeteria was a microcosm of the entire company's problems, and more importantly, it had developed solutions that the rest of Patterson Industries desperately needed. The corporate system tells us to order food based on projected headcount, but that doesn't account for shift changes, overtime, or department meetings. If we followed the system exactly, we'd have too much food on Mondays and run out on Fridays. The trainee asked how they handled this discrepancy. "We keep our own tracking system. We monitor actual consumption patterns, department schedules, and even weather forecasts. People eat more hot food when it's cold outside. We've learned to read the real signals instead of relying on the official projections." Sofia looked up from her notebook, suddenly understanding something crucial. The cafeteria had solved the exact same problem that was destroying the rest of the company: how to match supply with actual demand rather than theoretical demand. She spent the rest of the afternoon talking to Angela, learning about the informal systems that kept the cafeteria profitable when every other division was losing money. Angela had created feedback loops between the kitchen staff and the servers so they could adjust preparation quantities in real time. She had established communication channels with department supervisors to get advance notice of schedule changes. Most importantly, she had given frontline employees the authority to make adjustments without waiting for approval from corporate headquarters. "The funny thing is," Angela confided, "we've tried to share our methods with other departments, the procurement people, the inventory managers, the scheduling supervisors, but they always say our operation is too small or too simple to apply to their more complex processes." That evening, Sofia's mind was racing as she and her mother rode the bus home. She had discovered something that none of the expensive consultants had found. Patterson Industries already had a working model for success. It existed in the cafeteria and in dozens of informal workarounds that individual departments had developed to compensate for dysfunctional official processes. The problem wasn't that the company lacked solutions. The problem was that successful solutions were dismissed as irrelevant because they came from the wrong sources. Sofia decided she needed to document these success stories systematically. Over the next 3 days, she conducted what she thought of as her own consulting project. Unlike the professional consultants, they focused on finding what was working rather than cataloging what was broken. In the shipping department, she discovered that Maria Santos had dramatically reduced shipping errors by creating a simple checklist system that cross-referenced orders with actual inventory. Maria's system caught discrepancies that the official computer system missed, but management considered it redundant and had repeatedly tried to eliminate it. In the manufacturing division, she found that floor supervisor David Kim had developed an informal communication network between machine operators that allowed them to coordinate production schedules in real time. When machine B7 broke down, as Robert Chen had predicted it would, David's network could instantly redirect production to available machines, minimizing downtime. This network operated entirely outside official channels and was therefore invisible to corporate planning. In the quality control department, Sofia learned that Janet Williams had created an informal training program where experienced technicians taught new employees the difference between book knowledge and floor knowledge. This program had reduced defect rates by 30% in the sections where it was used, but it wasn't officially recognized because it wasn't part of the corporate training curriculum. What emerged from Sofia's investigation was a clear picture of two different companies operating in the same building. The official Patterson Industries, visible to consultants and executives, was indeed failing. Its processes were inefficient, its communication systems were broken, and its decision-making was disconnected from operational reality. But there was another Patterson Industries, invisible to management, where dedicated employees had created solutions that worked. These solutions were small-scale, locally implemented, and highly effective. They didn't show up in corporate reports because they operated outside official systems, but they were the reason the company hadn't collapsed entirely. Sofia realized that the 20-year crisis wasn't caused by the absence of solutions. It was caused by the systematic rejection of solutions that didn't fit the corporate model of how problems should be solved. The consultants failed because they were trying to fix the official company while ignoring the actual company. They analyzed processes that existed on organizational charts but not in practice. They interviewed executives who reported on systems that weren't actually being used. They made recommendations based on data that reflected policy rather than performance. Meanwhile, the solutions they were seeking already existed among the very employees they never thought to consult. Sofia's notebook now contained what amounted to a complete blueprint for transforming Patterson Industries, not through radical restructuring or expensive new technology, but through recognizing and scaling the innovations that successful employees had already developed. The cafeteria's demand forecasting system could be adapted for manufacturing planning. Maria Santos's inventory cross-checking process could be implemented company-wide. David Kim's machine coordination network could become the foundation for real-time production management. Janet Williams's training approach could bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical skill throughout the organization. But Sofia faced a challenge that no professional consultant had ever confronted: how to present insights that came from sources that weren't considered credible by the people who needed to hear them. She thought about her father's engineering problems. He had taught her that the best solutions were often simple, but simple didn't mean easy to implement. The hardest part of fixing something, he used to say, isn't figuring out what's wrong, it's convincing people that the fix doesn't have to be complicated. Patterson Industries' leadership had spent 20 years and millions of dollars looking for complex solutions to what they assumed was a complex problem. Would they be able to accept that the answer might be as simple as listening to their own employees? Sofia decided to test her theory on a smaller scale first. She would find a way to demonstrate that the informal solutions she had discovered could be formalized and expanded. She would prove that the company's own employees possessed the expertise that 37 consulting firms had failed to provide. But to do that, she would need to move beyond observation and documentation. She would need to find a way to bridge the gap between the official company and the actual company, between the executive suite and the factory floor. And she had an idea for how to do it. It was audacious, maybe even impossible for a 12-year-old girl to pull off. But her father had also taught her that impossible problems sometimes required impossible solutions. The question was whether she had the courage to try, and whether Thomas Patterson III would have the wisdom to recognize the value of insights that came from the most unexpected source imaginable. A child who had learned to see his company more clearly than he could see it himself. As the bus pulled up to their stop, Sofia closed her notebook and made a decision. Tomorrow, she would begin the most important phase of her investigation. She would find her way to make the invisible company visible and the silent solutions heard. The fate of 60,000 jobs might depend on whether a billionaire CEO was willing to listen to a 12-year-old girl who had discovered what his expensive consultants had missed. The answers were already there, waiting in the voices of the people who had never been asked the right questions. Friday morning brought an unexpected opportunity. As Sofia arrived at Patterson Industries with her mother, she noticed an unusual level of activity in the executive offices. Security guards were directing traffic in the hallways, and staff members were setting up additional chairs in the main conference room. When she asked her mother what was happening, Rebecca explained that Thomas Patterson III was hosting an emergency board meeting to discuss the company's future. "The rumors are that he's finally going to accept the consultant's recommendation," Rebecca whispered as they took the elevator to the 42nd floor. "They say he's going to announce the liquidation of the manufacturing division. 20,000 jobs, 20,000 people who won't have work by Christmas." Sofia felt a knot form in her stomach. She had spent the past week discovering solutions that could save those jobs, but she had no way to share what she had learned. The board meeting would happen in a few hours, critical decisions would be made, and the people who actually understood how to fix the company would never be consulted.
As her mother began her cleaning rounds, Sofia positioned herself in the break room with her notebook and tried to think of a way to change the trajectory of events. The hallway outside buzzed with the activity of board members arriving, executives preparing presentations, and assistants coordinating logistics for what everyone assumed would be Patterson Industries' surrender to 20 years of failure. That's when Sofia noticed something that gave her an idea. The conference room's audio-visual system was being tested by a technician she recognized, Tommy Chen, the younger brother of floor supervisor David Kim. Tommy had always been friendly to Sofia, often showing her interesting gadgets and explaining how various electronic systems worked throughout the building. During his lunch break, Sofia approached Tommy with what she hoped sounded like a reasonable request. "Tommy, I'm working on a school presentation about communication systems," she said, which was technically true if you considered what she was planning. "Could you show me how the conference room's video system works?" Tommy was happy to explain the setup. The main conference room had cameras and microphones that could connect to other locations throughout the building, allowing remote participation in meetings. The system could also record presentations and play video files from connected devices. "The cool thing is," Tommy said, demonstrating the controls, "you can preset everything to run automatically. Like, you could load a presentation onto the system, schedule it to start at a specific time, and it would play even if no one was in the room to operate it." Sofia absorbed this information carefully. An idea was forming in her mind, audacious and probably impossible, but potentially the only way to get the right information to the right people at the right time. That afternoon, while the board members took a break before their final session, Sofia put her plan into action. She had spent her lunch period in the company's computer lab, a small room adjacent to the break room where employees could access the internet and use basic software. Using skills her father had taught her and techniques she had learned in school computer classes, she created something unprecedented, a presentation that told the story of the real Patterson Industries. But this wasn't a typical business presentation with charts and graphs. Instead, Sofia had created a documentary-style video using the recording function on the computer lab's equipment. Over the past week, she had discreetly recorded brief interviews with the employees whose innovations she had discovered. She had asked each of them to explain their solutions in simple terms, pretending she was working on a school project about problem solving. Angela Porter explained her cafeteria demand forecasting system in 3 minutes. Maria Santos demonstrated her inventory cross-checking process using actual examples from the shipping dock. David Kim described his machine coordination network, showing how real-time communication could prevent the production delays that were costing the company millions. Janet Williams outlined her training methodology that bridged the gap between theory and practice. Sofia had woven these interviews together with her own narration, creating a 20-minute presentation that revealed the hidden Patterson Industries, the company that worked, the solutions that existed, and the people who had been ignored by every consultant and executive. The technical challenge was getting this presentation onto the conference room system without being detected. This is where Tommy Chen unknowingly became her accomplice. During the afternoon break, Sofia asked Tommy to show her how to load a video file onto the system, claiming she wanted to understand the process for her school project. You just connect your device here, select the file, and it uploads to the server. Then you can schedule it to play at whatever time you want. While Tommy was explaining the scheduling function, Sofia discreetly uploaded her presentation and set it to begin playing at exactly 4:30, the time when Thomas Patterson III was scheduled to give his closing remarks to the board about the company's future. Sofia's plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. When Patterson stood up to announce the liquidation of the manufacturing division, her presentation would begin playing instead. For 20 minutes, the board of directors would see and hear from the employees who had actually solved the problems that 37 consulting firms couldn't crack. It was corporate hijacking by a 12-year-old girl, and if it failed, her mother would certainly lose her job, and Sofia would probably be banned from the building forever. But if it worked, it might save 20,000 jobs and prove that solutions were hiding in plain sight throughout Patterson Industries. As 4:30 p.m. approached, Sofia positioned herself in the break room where she could see into the conference room through the glass doors. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure people could hear it. Board members were taking their seats, executives were shuffling through their final notes, and Thomas Patterson III was standing at the head of the table with a folder that Sofia suspected contained the liquidation plans. At 4:30 p.m., Patterson opened the folder and began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, after 20 years of struggle and millions spent on consulting, we've reached a difficult conclusion about our manufacturing operations. That's when the screens around the conference room flickered to life. Instead of Patterson's voice, Angela Porter's friendly face appeared on the monitors, explaining how she had solved the exact same supply and demand problems that were supposedly destroying the manufacturing division. Patterson stopped mid-sentence, staring at the screen in confusion. Board members looked around uncertainly as Maria Santos began demonstrating her inventory system that could prevent the shipping errors that were costing millions in returns and corrections. Sofia watched through the glass doors as 20 of the most powerful people in Chicago's business community listened to David Kim explain how real-time communication between machine operators could eliminate the production delays that made Patterson Industries uncompetitive. Some board members were reaching for their phones, probably to call security. Others were leaning forward, clearly intrigued by what they were hearing. Patterson himself stood frozen at the head of the table, his folder still open, his mouth slightly ajar as he watched his own employees explain solutions that no consultant had ever proposed. Then Janet Williams appeared on screen, describing her training program that had reduced defect rates by 30%. She mentioned specific numbers, actual results, measurable improvements that had been achieved not through expensive system overhauls, but through simple changes in how knowledge was shared. Sofia saw Patterson close his folder and sit down heavily in his chair. He wasn't angry, he was stunned. For the first time in 20 years, he was hearing about parts of his own company that actually worked, solutions that actually succeeded, employees who had actually solved the problems he thought were unsolvable. The presentation concluded with Sofia's own voice, recorded that morning in the computer lab. These people work for Patterson Industries every day. They've developed solutions that work, but no one has ever asked them what they know. Maybe the reason 37 consulting firms couldn't solve your problems is because they never talked to the people who had already solved them. The conference room fell silent. Board members stared at the now blank screens. Thomas Patterson III sat motionless, his hands flat on the table, his eyes unfocused as he processed what he had just witnessed. Sofia had done it. She had found a way to make the invisible company visible, to give voice to the silent solutions. Whether it would change anything remained to be seen, but for the first time in 20 years, the people who actually made Patterson Industries work had been heard in the room where the most important decisions were made. Now all Sofia could do was wait and see if a billionaire CEO would have the wisdom to recognize the value of insights that came from the most unexpected source imaginable, the employees he walked past every day, whose expertise he had never thought to seek. The silence in the conference room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Sofia watched through the glass doors as 20 of the most powerful business leaders in Chicago sat motionless, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, intrigue, and something that might have been embarrassment. The presentation had ended, but no one seemed to know what to do next. Thomas Patterson III remained seated at the head of the table, staring at the blank screen where his own employees had just demonstrated solutions that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his company. His liquidation folder lay closed beside him, temporarily forgotten in the wake of revelations that challenged 20 years of assumptions. Board member Margaret Wellington, the CEO of a major consulting firm herself, was the first to break the silence. "Thomas, how long have these innovations been in place?" Patterson didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be calculating something in his mind, perhaps trying to reconcile the success stories he had just witnessed with the failure reports that covered his desk every morning. "I honestly don't know," he finally admitted, his voice barely audible through the glass doors where Sofia was hiding. "I've never seen any of this before." Board member Charles Harrison, who had built his fortune in manufacturing, leaned forward in his chair. "That woman in shipping, Santos, she said her cross-checking system prevents 80% of the errors that our returns department processes every month. If that's true, we could cut our returns processing costs by millions annually." "And the machine coordination network," added Jennifer Walsh. "If this Kim fellow has actually solved our production delay problems, why haven't we scaled it company-wide?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. How had a company spent millions on consulting fees while ignoring solutions developed by its own workforce? How had 37 different consulting firms missed innovations that were happening on the factory floor every day? Sofia saw Patterson stand up slowly, his movements deliberate but uncertain. He walked to the window overlooking the manufacturing floor 42 stories below, his hands clasped behind him in the pose Sofia had observed during his many moments of private frustration. 20 years, he said, speaking to the window rather than to the board members behind him. 20 years of hiring the best minds in consulting, the top graduates from the finest business schools, the most prestigious firms in the country.
And we never once asked Maria Santos what she thought. The admission seemed to break something loose in the room. Board members began talking among themselves, their voices rising as the implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Sofia could catch fragments of their conversation through the glass doors. Cultural disconnect, management blindness, untapped human capital. But Patterson had fallen silent again, still staring out the window. Sofia recognized the expression on his face from the many times she had observed him in his private moments of defeat. This time, however, there was something different in his posture. Instead of the slumped shoulders of a man carrying the weight of failure, he stood straighter, as if a burden had been lifted rather than added. After several minutes of heated discussion among the board members, Patterson turned back to face the room. "I need to see this for myself," he announced, his voice carrying a new determination. "I need to talk to these people directly." Margaret Wellington looked concerned. "Thomas, we have a schedule to maintain. The liquidation timeline requires board approval by—" "The liquidation is postponed," Patterson interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If there's even a possibility that we've been overlooking solutions that could save this company, I'm not moving forward until I understand what we've missed."
Sofia felt her heart racing. Her impossible plan was working, but she was also acutely aware that she was about to be discovered. If Patterson was going to investigate the employees featured in her presentation, he would inevitably trace the video back to its source. Her secret role in the day's events wouldn't remain secret for long. The board meeting dissolved into smaller conversations as members tried to process the unexpected turn of events. Some seemed skeptical about postponing major decisions based on an unauthorized presentation. Others appeared genuinely intrigued by the possibility that solutions had been hiding in plain sight. All of them seemed to recognize that the day had taken a direction that none of their expensive strategic planning had anticipated. As the board members began to file out of the conference room, Sofia realized she needed to make a decision. She could slip away, return to the break room, and pretend she had never been involved. Her mother would finish her cleaning duties, they would go home, and Sofia could wait to see what happened next from a safe distance. Or she could step forward and take responsibility for what she had done. She could reveal herself as the source of the presentation and offer to help Patterson understand what she had discovered about his company. It was a terrifying prospect, a 12-year-old girl approaching a billionaire CEO to offer business advice. But it was also the only way to ensure that the insights she had uncovered would be properly understood and implemented. Sofia's decision was made for her when Patterson, still standing by the conference room window, spotted her reflection in the glass. He turned around and looked directly at her through the glass doors, their eyes meeting across the space that separated the executive world from the service world. For a moment, neither of them moved. Patterson's expression was unreadable, but Sofia could see recognition dawning in his eyes. He was connecting the dots, realizing that the presentation he had just witnessed hadn't materialized out of thin air. Someone had created it. Someone had planned it. Someone had orchestrated the most effective business intervention in Patterson Industries' recent history. Patterson walked to the conference room doors and opened them, stepping into the break room where Sofia sat with her notebook still open on the table. The few remaining board members who hadn't yet left stopped their conversations and watched this unexpected encounter. "You were in here during the presentation," Patterson said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been respect. "You saw everything that happened in that room." Sofia nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "That presentation, someone made that video. Someone interviewed those employees. Someone edited their responses together. Someone scheduled it to play during our board meeting." He paused, studying Sofia's face. "Someone who had access to our building, who knew our employees, who understood our problems well enough to identify the people who had actually solved them." Sofia's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to meet Patterson's gaze. "Yes, sir," she said simply. The break room fell completely silent. Even the board members who had been preparing to leave stopped in the doorway, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in corporate America, a billionaire CEO having a strategic conversation with a 12-year-old girl. Patterson pulled out a chair and sat down across from Sofia, bringing himself to her eye level. It was the same gesture she had observed him make with other people during important conversations, but she had never imagined being on the receiving end of his full attention. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sofia Martinez," she replied, her voice stronger now. "Sofia Martinez," Patterson repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "And you're Rebecca's daughter. You've been coming to this building for 3 years." "Yes, sir." Patterson was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what he was learning. "Sofia, did you create that presentation we just watched?" There was no point in lying. "Yes, sir." "How?" "I talk to people," Sofia said simply. "The people who actually do the work. I ask them about their jobs, about the problems they face, about the solutions they've found, and I listened." The simplicity of her explanation seemed to hit Patterson like a physical blow. 37 consulting firms had failed to solve his company's problems, and a 12-year-old girl had found the answers by doing the one thing the experts had never thought to try: asking employees themselves. Patterson leaned back in his chair, a look of wonder and dismay crossing his face. "That's impossible," he whispered. But even as he said it, Sofia could see that it wasn't impossible at all. It had happened. She had done it. The evidence was sitting right in front of him, asking him to accept that the most profound business insight in his company's recent history had come from a source that no MBA program would ever consider credible. "That's impossible," he repeated, but this time his voice carried amazement rather than disbelief. And Sofia knew that everything was about to change. The break room had transformed into an impromptu boardroom, with several directors pulling up chairs around the small table where Sofia sat with her notebook. What had begun as a private conversation between Patterson and Sofia had evolved into something unprecedented, a formal business consultation with a 12-year-old strategic advisor. Margaret Wellington, despite her initial skepticism, had been the first to join them. "I've been in consulting for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like this. If a child could identify solutions that our entire industry missed, we need to understand how."
Charles Harrison nodded in agreement. "The manufacturing sector has been hemorrhaging jobs for decades. Companies like ours have been throwing money at consultants, trying everything except the obvious." He gestured towards Sofia. "Ask the people who actually do the work." Patterson leaned forward, his attention focused entirely on Sofia. "Walk me through it," he said. "How did you know where to look for solutions when 37 professional consulting firms couldn't find them?" Sofia opened her notebook to the first page of observation she had made weeks earlier. "My dad was an engineer," she began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "He taught me that when something's broken, you don't just look at the part that's failing, you follow the whole system to understand why it's failing." She flipped to a diagram she had drawn showing the 2 versions of Patterson Industries. "The consultants were analyzing this company," she said, pointing to the left side of her drawing, "the one that exists in reports and organizational charts. But the real company is this one." She moved her finger to the right side, the one where people actually work every day. Jennifer Walsh, who had built her career in operations management, studied Sofia's diagram with obvious interest. "You're saying the consultants were analyzing theoretical processes instead of actual operations?" "Exactly," Sofia replied. "They interviewed executives who manage systems, but they never talked to the people who use those systems. It's like trying to fix a car by only talking to the person who bought it, not the mechanic who works on it every day." The analogy seemed to resonate with the business leaders around the table. Patterson rubbed his temples, a gesture Sofia had observed countless times when he was processing difficult information. So all these years, we've been trying to fix problems that existed mainly on paper, while ignoring the people who had actually solved the real problems. Not ignoring, Sofia corrected gently. You just didn't know the solutions existed. The people who developed them didn't think they were important enough to report up the chain, and the people making decisions didn't think to ask. Charles Harrison leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slowly. It's a communication breakdown so fundamental that we couldn't even see it. We were looking in all the wrong places because we didn't know the right places existed. Sofia turned to a fresh page in her notebook and began sketching in real time. Angela in the cafeteria solved your demand forecasting problem 3 years ago, but nobody asked her how she did it because food service isn't considered strategically important. She drew quick lines connecting different departments. Maria Santos solved your inventory accuracy problem, but shipping isn't consulted on inventory management policy. David Kim solved your production coordination problem, but floor supervisors don't get invited to operations planning meetings. As she spoke, she could see understanding dawn on the faces around her. These weren't isolated success stories, they were systematic solutions that could be scaled across the entire organization. Margaret Wellington pulled out her own notebook and began taking notes. What you're describing is a classic organizational blind spot. Senior management gets information filtered through multiple layers, and by the time it reaches decision makers, the practical insights have been stripped away. But how do we fix it? Patterson asked, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and frustration. How do we bridge this gap when our entire corporate structure is built around the separation between strategic decision-making and operational implementation? Sofia had been thinking about this question all week. You don't need to change your structure. You just need to change who gets invited to the conversations. She flipped to another page in her notebook, one filled with names and departments. Angela Porter should be consulting on supply chain planning because she's already solved supply chain problems. Maria Santos should be involved in inventory policy because she's developed systems that work better than the official ones. David Kim should be part of operations strategy because he's created coordination methods that the official systems don't have. The simplicity of the solution seemed to strike the executives like a physical force. Patterson stared at Sofia's list of names, employees who walked past his office every day, people whose insights could have saved his company millions in consulting fees and years of struggle. It's not about replacing the consultants, Sofia continued. It's about consulting the right people. The experts you need are already on your payroll. They're just not in the positions where their expertise gets recognized. Angela Walsh was nodding vigorously. We've been treating operational knowledge and strategic knowledge as completely separate domains. But in manufacturing, they're the same thing. You can't develop effective strategy without understanding actual operations. Patterson stood up and walked to the break room window, looking down at the manufacturing floors below. For the first time in years, he wasn't seeing failure and inefficiency. He was seeing a reservoir of untapped expertise, solutions that had been hiding in plain sight while he searched desperately for answers in consulting reports and business school theories. Sofia, he said, turning back to the group, what would happen if we brought these people, Angela, Maria, David, Janet, all of them, into our strategic planning process? What if we made operational expertise a formal part of executive decision-making? Sofia smiled for the first time since the conversation began. I think you'd discover that most of your problems have already been solved. You just need to scale the solutions that work instead of trying to fix the systems that don't. Charles Harrison was shaking his head in amazement. 20 years, he muttered. 20 years of assuming that the people closest to the problems couldn't contribute to strategic solutions. It's not just Patterson Industries, Margaret Wellington added. This pattern exists throughout corporate America. We've created such rigid hierarchies between strategy and operations that we've lost the ability to learn from our own organizations.
Patterson returned to his seat,
but his entire demeanor had changed. The defeated posture Sofia had observed for months was gone, replaced by an energy she hadn't seen since she first started coming to the building. "We're not liquidating the manufacturing division," he announced. "We're going to do something that apparently no one in business has thought to try. We're going to ask our own employees how to run our own company." The declaration sent a ripple of excitement through the small group, but Sofia felt a flutter of nervousness as well. She had succeeded in getting Patterson to see the problem and recognize the solution, but implementation would be far more complex than diagnosis. "Mr. Patterson," she said quietly, "there's something else you should know. The people I talk to, they've been developing these solutions for years, but they've also been discouraged from sharing them. Some have tried to report their innovations to supervisors and been told it wasn't their job to think about company-wide problems." Patterson's expression darkened. "They were told not to solve problems?" "They were told to stay in their lanes," Sofia clarified, "to focus on their specific jobs and let management worry about the bigger picture. So if you really want to access their expertise, you'll need to make it safe for them to share what they know. They'll need to trust that their insights will be valued, not dismissed." The room fell quiet as the executives absorbed this additional layer of complexity. It wasn't enough to simply invite operational employees into strategic conversations. The entire corporate culture would need to shift to recognize and reward the kind of cross-functional thinking that had been systematically discouraged. But Patterson's response surprised everyone, including Sofia. He smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in months. "Then, we're going to do something else that apparently no one in business has thought to try. We're going to create a company culture where the best ideas win regardless of where they come from or who suggests them." It was an ambitious vision, perhaps impossibly ambitious, but as Sofia looked around the table at executives who had been transformed from skeptics to advocates in the span of a single afternoon, she began to believe that impossible things might be exactly what Patterson Industries needed.
David Kim spoke next, his confidence building as he saw the executives genuinely listening. "In manufacturing, we have a similar problem with production scheduling. The official system tells us to make products in a predetermined sequence, but machines break down, materials arrive late, and priorities change. So we've developed an informal communication network that lets us adapt in real time." Jennifer Walsh pulled out her phone and began taking notes. "Walk me through how this network operates." "Every machine operator knows the status of every other machine on the floor. When machine B7 goes down, which it does every third Tuesday, we don't wait for official rescheduling. The operators communicate directly and redistribute the workload immediately." David gestured as he spoke, his hands mapping out the flow of information. "We've reduced downtime by about 40% using this system." 40%? Patterson's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Our consultants told us that our downtime was an inevitable result of aging equipment." "The equipment is aging," David acknowledged, "but most of our downtime comes from communication delays, not mechanical failures. When a machine breaks, it takes an average of 37 minutes for the information to travel through official channels and result in work redistribution. Our informal system does it in under 3 minutes. The room fell silent as the executives absorbed this information. Sofia could see them calculating the financial implications of David's innovation. 40% reduction in manufacturing downtime translated to millions of dollars in increased productivity, all achieved through better communication rather than expensive equipment upgrades. Maria Santos from shipping contributed her own insights about inventory accuracy, describing systems she had developed that cross-referenced digital records with physical reality. The computer system shows what should be in inventory, but I've learned to verify everything manually because there's always a gap between the digital record and actual stock. Always? The chief financial officer asked. Always. Sometimes it's small, a few units here and there. Sometimes it's major, entire product lines that show as available but are actually damaged or misplaced.
The manual cross-checking catches these discrepancies before they become customer service problems. Sofia realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in corporate America. Operational employees explaining to executives how work actually gets done, rather than how organizational charts suggested it should be done. The gap between theory and practice, which had been invisible to consultants, was being mapped in real time by the people who navigated it every day. Janet Williams from Quality Control presented perhaps the most striking revelation. The official testing procedures, she said carefully, were designed by people who understood the science, but not the production environment. Some tests that are supposed to be critical don't actually predict product performance. Other measurements that are dismissed as unimportant are actually the best indicators of quality. Give me a specific example, Patterson requested. Product line D. The official stress test measures pressure resistance at room temperature, but our customers use these products in environments that range from below freezing to over 100 degrees. The room temperature test is essentially meaningless for predicting real-world performance. Janet's voice grew more confident as she spoke. I developed a modified testing protocol that cycles through temperature ranges during stress testing. It catches failures that the official test misses. And management's response to your modified protocol? Margaret Wellington asked. I was told that deviation from official testing procedures was not permitted. So I run both tests. I use the official results for reports and my modified test to actually ensure quality. The implications of Janet's revelation sent ripples of uncomfortable recognition through the executive team. Their quality control system was producing reports that satisfied regulatory requirements but failed to predict customer satisfaction. Meanwhile, the employee responsible for actual quality assurance was operating a shadow system that worked but was officially discouraged. Sofia looked around the room and saw the transformation happening in real time. Executives who had arrived expecting to humor a child's naive business advice were discovering that their own employees possessed expertise that surpassed anything their expensive consultants had provided. But she also noticed something else. The operational employees were growing more animated as they realized their insights were being valued. Years of frustration at being excluded from strategic conversations were giving way to enthusiasm about finally being heard. There's one more thing, Rebecca said quietly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. Her voice was gentle, but carried the authority of someone who had observed the entire organization from a unique vantage point. All these solutions that Angela and David and Maria and Janet developed, they didn't happen in isolation. They talk to each other. They share ideas across departments. There's an entire informal network of problem solvers in this company. Patterson leaned forward. What do you mean? When Angela figured out her demand forecasting system, she mentioned it to Maria during a coffee break. Maria adapted some of the principles for inventory tracking. When David developed his machine coordination network, he talked to Janet about how communication breakdowns affect quality control. These innovations have been cross-pollinating through informal conversations for years. Sofia felt her heart racing as her mother revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The solutions they had discovered weren't isolated improvements. They were components of an integrated system that had been developing organically throughout Patterson Industries. The employees hadn't just solved individual problems, they had unconsciously created a more effective way of running the entire company. So, what you're telling me is we have two Patterson Industries, the official one that's been failing for 20 years and an unofficial one that's been succeeding through informal networks and unauthorized innovations. Yes, sir, Rebecca replied simply.
Patterson stood up and walked to the window, his movement followed by every pair of eyes in the room. When he turned back to face the group, his expression had changed completely. The doubt and frustration that had marked his demeanor for months was gone, replaced by something Sofia had never seen from him before: genuine excitement. Then we're going to do something that's apparently never been tried in corporate history, he announced. We're going to make the unofficial company the official one. 6 months later, Sofia Martinez walked through the halls of Patterson Industries with a sense of wonder that never quite faded.
The building looked the same from the outside, but everything else had changed in ways that seemed almost magical to her 12-year-old perspective. The executive offices still occupied the 42nd floor, but they no longer felt like a separate world from the rest of the company. Conference rooms that had once hosted endless consulting presentations now buzzed with cross-departmental teams, where Angela Porter's supply chain insights influenced manufacturing schedules and David Kim's coordination methods were being adapted for customer service operations. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Patterson's declaration that the company would make the unofficial company the official one had triggered months of intensive restructuring that challenged every assumption about corporate hierarchy and decision-making. But the results spoke for themselves, in language that even skeptical board members couldn't ignore: cold, hard numbers. Manufacturing efficiency had increased by 43% once David Kim's machine coordination network became the official production management system. Customer complaints had dropped by 67% after Maria Santos's inventory verification methods were implemented company-wide. Product returns fell by 52% when Janet Williams's temperature cycling quality tests replaced the outdated official protocols. Most remarkably, these improvements had been achieved without hiring a single consultant or purchasing any major new equipment. The solutions had been there all along, waiting to be recognized and scaled. Sofia's role in the company had evolved in ways that defied traditional corporate categories. Officially, she was listed as a strategic operations consultant, a title that had been invented specifically for her unique position. Practically, she served as a bridge between the executive world and the operational world, translating insights in both directions and identifying opportunities for cross-departmental innovation. Her office, a small room adjacent to Patterson's executive suite, was unlike any corporate space in the building. The walls were covered with diagrams that looked like combination organizational charts and engineering schematics, mapping the flow of ideas and innovations throughout the company. Her desk was scattered with notebooks filled with observations, sketches of process improvements, and interviews with employees at every level of the organization. But the most significant change wasn't visible in productivity metrics or organizational charts. It was in the culture of the company itself. Employees who had spent years feeling invisible and unheard now approached their work with a new sense of ownership and possibility. The informal networks that had developed workarounds and solutions now operated as official innovation channels, with successful ideas being rapidly tested and implemented across the organization. Thomas Patterson III had been transformed as well. The defeated, frustrated executive Sofia had first observed was gone, replaced by a leader who spent more time on manufacturing floors and in shipping departments than in conference rooms. He had learned to listen in ways that Harvard Business School had never taught, to recognize expertise that didn't come with advanced degrees or executive titles. "You saved my company," he had told Sofia during one of their weekly strategy sessions. "But more than that, you taught me to see my own company. I was looking at Patterson Industries through reports and presentations when I should have been looking at it through the eyes of the people who make it work every day." The business world had taken notice. Harvard Business School had requested case studies of what was being called the Patterson Protocol. Other major corporations were attempting to replicate the company's transformation, though most struggled to overcome their own hierarchical blindness. Consulting firms were quietly studying Patterson Industries' methods, trying to understand how a 12-year-old had accomplished what their combined expertise had failed to achieve. But Sofia remained focused on the work itself rather than the recognition. She had discovered that business problem-solving
wasn't fundamentally different from the engineering principles her father had taught her. It was about paying attention to details that others overlooked, listening to voices that others ignored, and understanding that the most sophisticated solutions often grew from simple insights applied with wisdom and persistence. Rebecca Martinez had also been transformed by the company's evolution. Her official title was now Director of Operational Intelligence, but her role was essentially to serve as Sofia's partner in identifying and documenting innovations throughout the organization. The quiet woman who had spent years cleaning offices was now a key strategic advisor, her unique perspective on organizational dynamics proving invaluable to executive decision-making. "I never thought my job would become this important," she confided in Sofia one evening as they rode the bus home. "I always figured the important work was happening in the offices I cleaned, not in the observations I made while cleaning them." "Dad always said that important work was happening everywhere," Sofia replied, thinking of her father's engineering wisdom. "The trick is learning to recognize it." The financial results of Patterson Industries' transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. The company that had been hemorrhaging money for 20 years was now profitable across every division. The manufacturing operations that had been scheduled for liquidation were now the most efficient in the industry. Stock price had tripled, and the company was hiring rather than laying off workers.
But for Sofia, the most satisfying changes were the small human moments that didn't show up in quarterly reports. Angela Porter beaming with pride as she presented supply chain innovations to a room full of executives. David Kim training supervisors from other companies on coordination methods that had originated on his manufacturing floor. Maria Santos receiving a company-wide award for excellence in operational innovation. Janet Williams leading quality control training sessions that were now considered industry best practices. The employees who had been invisible had become indispensable. The solutions that had been dismissed as irrelevant had become the foundation of a corporate turnaround that business schools would study for decades. As Sofia sat in her small office on a Friday afternoon, reviewing notes from her latest round of employee interviews, she reflected on how a simple question had changed everything. What are the consultants missing? Had led her down a path of discovery that revealed fundamental truths about how organizations actually worked versus how they were supposed to work. Patterson knocked on her door and entered with the comfortable familiarity that had developed during their months of collaboration. "I have something to show you," he said, placing a framed newspaper article on her desk. The headline read, "Patterson Industries named Manufacturer of the Year." Below it was a photo of the management team, with Sofia prominently positioned between Patterson and her mother, her notebook open in her hands. "They wanted to know the secret to our turnaround," Patterson said. "I told them it wasn't a secret at all. We just started listening to the people who actually do the work." Sofia studied the photograph, remembering the nervous 12-year-old who had sat in the break room 6 months earlier, wondering if she had the courage to speak up about what she had discovered. That girl seemed like a different person now, though Sofia knew the core insights that had driven her investigation remained unchanged. Pay attention to details, listen to voices that others ignore, and never assume that the people making decisions have all the information they need. "There's something else," Patterson continued. "The board of directors has established an annual award for employee innovation. They want to call it the Sofia Martinez Award for Operational Excellence." Sofia looked up from the newspaper article, surprised by the unexpected honor. "That's nice, but I think it should be named after all the people who actually developed the solutions. Angela and David and Maria and Janet and everyone else who figured out how to make things work better." Patterson smiled, the expression carrying warmth and respect that Sofia had earned through months of proving that age and position were less important than insight and dedication. "I suggested that too. They said the award would honor employees who demonstrate your approach, looking for solutions in places where others don't think to look, and giving voice to innovations that might otherwise remain invisible." As Sofia prepared to leave the office that evening, she took one last look around the space that had become her temporary home.
Her notebooks were filled with observations, innovations, and insights that had transformed a failing company into an industry leader. But she knew her work at Patterson Industries was essentially complete. The systems were in place, the culture had shifted, and the company had learned to listen to its own expertise. Her mother was waiting by the elevator, ready for their daily journey home. As they descended 42 floors from executive suite to street level, Sofia thought about her father and the engineering principles that had guided her investigation. He had taught her that the best solutions were often hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right perspective to recognize their value. Standing on the sidewalk outside Patterson Industries, looking up at the towering building that housed thousands of employees whose voices had finally been heard, Sofia realized that her father's lessons had proven true in ways he never could have imagined. The most sophisticated business transformation of the decade had grown from simple engineering wisdom. Pay attention to details, follow the whole system, and never forget that the people closest to the work usually understand it best. 6 months ago, she was an invisible 12-year-old girl doing homework in corporate break rooms. Today, she was a strategic consultant whose insights had saved 20,000 jobs and proven that wisdom could come from the most unexpected sources. The bus arrived, and Sofia and her mother took their seats for the ride home. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. There were other companies with other problems, other voices waiting to be heard, other solutions hiding in plain sight. Her work had just begun, and somewhere in Chicago, another 12-year-old was probably sitting in another break room, noticing details that adults had learned to ignore, ready to ask the simple questions that could change everything. The transformation was complete, but the story would continue. After all, the best solutions were always hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone curious enough to look. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.